And to I shared earlier this week in our e-blast that I've been finding it hard to watch the coverage of the invasion of Ukraine without tears. This remains true. When I read that this is the first time in many cases that air raid sirens have sounded since World War II, when I read of folks never trained as soldiers signing up and receiving their guns to defend the city, when I read of Ukrainians bombing their own bridges to prevent the invading army from coming in. And I don't know if you saw it, but when I read of the women who offered sunflower seeds to the Russian soldiers so that when they die, at least sunflowers will grow where they have invaded. When I watch the images of the tanks, of burned out buildings, of soldiers walking the streets, it's hard not to feel overwhelmed, overcome. It's hard not to desire to hide from the news. And the opportunity comes immediately. If you watch actual TV news, not infrequently there's a break for ads. And from death and destruction, we jump to commercials letting us know how to replace our broken windshield, to ads for action movies, to spots encouraging us to buy vitamins that will help us feel younger and more vibrant. The contrast is jarring. It's really somewhat stunning, actually. And for me, it inevitably raises this question of what does it mean to care for the lives of people on the other side of the world? What does it mean to shed tears and to feel fear and to cry out at the injustice? What can we do? More than one of you asked me that. There is this contrast between our lives and the lives of people in the cities of Ukraine. And even just a week ago, perhaps that contrast was not quite so stark, though of course our privileges way outnumbered theirs in many cases. We've talked a lot this month about care and empathy. In February, we often do. We focus on love and care. We've talked about what it is to care for ourselves, to care for our loved ones, to care for our small communities like this. But there's that last piece, the piece about what it means to care for people we have never and will never meet. Or even what does it mean to care for someone we consider an opponent or an enemy? What does it mean to care about issues that don't affect us directly? What does it mean to care through our privilege? Bryan Stevenson, as I mentioned, is a lawyer and the founder of the Equal Justice Initiative. The EJI, based in Montgomery, Alabama, is a human rights organization working to end mass incarceration, unjust imprisonment, and working to end racial and economic injustice. If you don't know their work, I encourage you to check it out. We'll try to drop a link to the website in the chat later. Stevenson also wrote the book Just Mercy, which chronicles some of that work he and the EJI have done. It also got made into a movie. So Stevenson has many powerful things to say, and if I were going to recommend a rabbit hole for your Sunday afternoon, it would be to go Google Stevenson and watch a bunch of videos. He's articulated 4 keys to challenging the status quo and achieving peace and justice. Those 4 keys are: 1, stay proximate to the people you are trying to help. 2, change the narrative around the problem you are trying to solve. 3, don't lose hope. And 4, the reminder that pursuing peace and justice requires doing things that are uncomfortable and inconvenient. These rules can help us, Stevenson believes, build the world that we dream of. And that goal, he reminds us, changing the world, that goal is a worthy one to pursue and not one that we should feel naive or foolish to proclaim. And I have to say that that first one, the staying proximate, is what is sitting with me this week. Get proximate. That's what he describes in the clip we watched. Get close, get near, find a way to know the people you are working with and working for. The brief section of the talk that we heard comes after Stevenson describes an encounter when he was visiting a client, a child, who'd been imprisoned as an adult. Stevenson is trying to get this boy to talk to him so he can help the child. And at first he won't speak. But Stevenson kind of leans his body closer, and then the boy leans his body back closer. And then the boy begins to tell him about the terrible things that have happened since he arrived in the adult male jail, and eventually too about the incident that led to his imprisonment. And Stevenson says that this was a moment that taught him about the value of being there, being present, being close, this getting proximate. Because when we get proximate, we find it much harder to dehumanize and demean. When we get proximate meaningfully, we find it much harder to enact violence, to create walls, to draw lines between us. And we are very, very good at drawing lines in this country, both literal and figurative ones. We drew lines down the center of our nation, dictating where it was acceptable to own another human being and where not. We drew lines that determined where freedom began. We drew red lines to corral folks into certain geographic areas or to keep them out of others. Villages like Ridgewood have this in their past. Up until the 1950s, and my father tells this story because he had relatives living in Ridgewood. Ridgewood had a sign that hung above the town that proclaimed it was a restricted community. Not a specific set of words, but everyone knew that meant Jews weren't welcome. Last April, a group of high school students discovered the history of redlining, I should say uncovered, the history of redlining, of deeds that declared Blacks weren't allowed to own them, of real estate codes in the village of Ridgewood that said the village wanted to, quote, bring here only the kind of people who are here, and thus preserve the congenial neighbor tradition. This village and this whole country has a long history in the North and the South of trying really, really hard not to get proximate, to stay separate. And the end result is children who grow up isolated in homogenous communities that perpetuate, at best, a lack of understanding, and more often, a fear and hatred that breeds oppression. We segregate aggressively by race and by economic status and by religion. And when we segregate from one another in this way, we lose so much more than just perspective. When we go beyond that segregation, we ask folks to hide themselves. In truth, we don't ask. We demand on pain of violence and danger that folks whose identities can be hidden hide them or deny them. The newest anti-LGBTQ+ laws are a reminder of this. You've probably seen this, but in Florida, the House of Representatives passed a bill which has yet to be made into law, but might, making it illegal to say the words gay or trans in classrooms. So teachers would not be allowed to talk about or teach about LGBTQ+ issues or to reassure their students that they're safe. In Texas, the Attorney General wrote an opinion that classifies gender-affirming care as child abuse, meaning any teacher, doctor, or other professional who's a mandated reporter who comes in contact with a child receiving gender-affirming care is supposed to report that as child abuse so that the adults in that child's life can be prosecuted and the child potentially removed. Although the ACLU is clear that the opinion and the letter from the governor demanding that folks enforce the opinion, the ACLU is clear these are not legally binding. But the point is that attempt is one among so many to force folks to deny who they are and hide their truths. When we deny people their wholeness in this way, we do violence and we create grief. We don't just strive to create pockets of separateness in which we can avoid confronting difference. We also like to sequester away anything that makes us uncomfortable. Our food production processes, our waste management, our imprisonment, anything that makes us question the way we're doing things. There's a book, Every 12 Seconds, the book is titled, and it explores this. In it, the author, a political scientist named Timothy Packerat, goes undercover at a slaughterhouse to experience what our meat production is like from that side of things. And in the book, he compellingly argues that we have a culture of hiding things away. And he poses the question, what would happen if instead we brought it all into daylight? He writes, quote, in this world, there would be no all-volunteer armies, only a compulsory draft. First, a selection of the children of the decision makers and weapons manufacturers, and then one organized by tax bracket from highest to lowest. No dedicated spaces of extraordinary rendition would exist. The enhanced interrogation techniques performed on our behalf would be conducted before our eyes in our living rooms and public squares. No garbage truck would come in the dark morning hours of our dreams to take our waste out of sight and consciousness. The sick, old, and the mad would not be shut away behind impenetrable walls of jargon and concrete. It's a powerful idea. And it's hard to imagine that world because this idea of getting proximate is actually quite countercultural in America. We hide from difference. We push away what we don't understand. We force into hiding those that we fear. We keep away what is messy. And so to confront what is real in our behavior and real in another human being, one might even call that revolutionary. Valerie Kaur is a civil rights activist, a lawyer, a documentary filmmaker, and the founder of the Revolutionary Love Project. It's a project that endeavors to help folks learn how to move differently in the world in order to create a better world. Kaur writes this: revolutionary love is the choice to labor for others, our opponents, and ourselves. We imagine these practices as points on a compass, and I'll invite you to look at the screen. We're going to share an image. Perfect. So she says a choice to labor, right? So this is work, it's labor. And I encourage you, we'll also try to link this at the end of the service as well, but to look up Valerie Kaur's work. Today we're going to talk about the point on the compass that is loving others. She has this to say: seeing no stranger begins in wonder. It is to look upon the face of anyone and choose to say, "You are a part of me I do not yet know." Wonder is the wellspring for love. Who we wonder about determines whose stories we hear and whose joy and pain we share. Those we grieve with, those we sit with and weep with, are ultimately those we organize with and advocate for. When a critical mass of people come together to wonder about one another, grieve with one another, and fight with and for one another, we begin to build the solidarity needed for collective liberation and transformation, a solidarity rooted in love. So she's saying something we actually know really well in small communities like this. You are a part of me I do not know yet, and I will listen to your story and hear your pain. That's exactly what getting proximate is. The instruction is the same from Kaur and from Stevenson, from ancient wisdom, from the rabbit who sat by the child whose block tower fell. We have to get close enough to see, to hear, to know. We have to be willing to approach one another with wonder and curiosity in spite of fear. We have to be willing to experience discomfort ourselves. Revolutionary love, real proximity, witnessing, knowing, these ask us to cross the lines we've created, and they ask us to set aside our privilege. They ask us to take risks and make ourselves vulnerable. And doing this, getting proximate, that's the thing that's going to change the world. So how do we actually do it? Getting proximate when we live on the other side of the country is hard. And yes, watch the news, consume it wisely and well. Being informed about the world is part of being proximate. But it's also about hearing and seeing actual life on the ground. I don't mean go there, right? But stories of real lives, real first-person narratives. Those are the things that help us get proximate when actually being close is impossible. Those stories, that's what breaks our hearts open and makes us wonder how we're going to get to a future. But it's also the thing that gives us the most hope. Poetry, anecdotes, the narratives of people living and experiencing pain and also joy right now. The Ukrainian poet Ilya Kaminsky wrote a poem back in 2013 that's been circulating on social media right now. And he was, although born in Ukraine, his family moved to America when he was a child. And he wrote this poem titled, "We Lived Happily During the War." It goes like this. And when they bombed other people's houses, we protested, but not enough. We opposed them, but not enough. I was in my bed. Around my bed, America was falling. Invisible house by invisible house by invisible house. I took a chair outside and watched the sun. In the 6th month of a disastrous reign, in the house of money, in the street of money, in the city of money, in the country of money, our great country of money, we, forgive us, lived happily during the war. It is a powerful poem about what it means to watch from the other side of the world, even from the other side of the country or the other side of town, or from another place on the spectrum of gender and sexuality, to watch suffering and misery of someone we see as other. And yet the poem's not designed to bring guilt, but awareness. It's an important distinction. The ask is not, by this poem, by Kaur, by Stevenson, or by me, the ask is not to feel shame that you're lucky enough to be among the privileged, or ask to be miserable or become unhappy. The ask is to get proximate physically through storytelling, however it's possible to do so, even if it requires us to give up comfort. The ask is to get proximate and still retain our hope, right? That was one of the keys that Stevenson lists for finding justice. You have to keep that hope. You have to experience joy even as you allow yourself to feel the pain of the world. The ask is to keep writing music that over 100 years later stirs the soul to resistance and compassion, to keep writing poetry that captures beautifully the human condition, to keep opening our hearts to each other over and over again, to keep fighting for justice in the courts and on the streets, to keep loving in revolutionary ways so that perhaps one day we will live in a world where nations don't invade one another, and each individual and each country is respected in its autonomy. The ask is to keep being a presence, a witness, so that others are seen and known and welcomed and celebrated in the circle of care and community. The ask is to remember always, with hope, that expanding the circle is the right path forward. Get proximate, get working, and get loving, even when it is hard. That is the ask. May we rise to the call.